At just 19, Harmony Korine wrote one of the most controversial films ever made, and Hollywood saw him as the future. Then he disappeared. By choice. So what actually happened? Did Harmony Korine destroy his own career, as many people claim, or did he escape Hollywood on purpose? When we look at Korine's career, it looks like a rise followed by chaos, followed by near silence. The kind of trajectory people automatically read as failure. But I want to challenge that logic, because that's not what happened here. While Hollywood was trying to figure out what to do with him, Korine was already moving in the opposite direction. Not to chase bigger films or wider audiences, but to chase something much harder to define. And to understand why, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the film that made him famous and at the same time almost impossible to work with. Harmony Korine grew up in Nashville, and being the son of a documentary filmmaker, he was exposed early on to filmmaking. But his own interests leaned more towards street culture, writing, and observation. As a teenager, he moved to New York and became immersed in the city's skate scene, spending time with people his own age and documenting fragments of real life that most films wouldn't really be interested in. That experience is what led directly to Kids. The script was seemingly built from real conversations, real behavior, and a version of youth culture that felt largely unseen on screen at that time. When he met Larry Clark, who had been photographing similar subjects for years, the collaboration formed quickly. Clark would direct, but it was Korine's voice, which was very specific, unfiltered, and I would say deliberately uncomfortable, that defined the whole film for me. When Kids premiered in 1995, it immediately sparked controversy. Its depiction of teenage life, sexuality, and STDs divided critics and audiences, but it also, more importantly, made an impact. The film became a defining work of the 1990s American independent cinema. And Korine, still a teenager, was suddenly at the center of it. Almost overnight, he was seen as a distinctive new voice, someone who could capture a level of realism that felt raw, unpredictable, and confrontational. The industry took notice, and with that came an important opportunity, a breakthrough that usually opens doors to larger budgets, wider audiences, and what many like to call long-term stability. And he got there before he was even 20. But instead of moving toward that path, Korine's next steps would take him further away from it. And that's exactly where things start to break. From what I could understand, after Kids, the expectation was perhaps that Korine would work on a follow-up that would build up or add to that momentum. Something a little bit more structured maybe, but instead, Harmony Korine makes Gummo, a film that moves away from traditional storytelling almost entirely. And what I mean by this is that there's no central plot or no clear progression. It just seems like a series of loosely connected scenes set in a small Ohio town built from fragments of everyday life. Made with non-professional actors, improvised moments, and a tone that feels more akin to documentary than fiction, I would say. Gummo was a deliberate shift though, but it also changed how Korine's work was also received. Where Kids shocked but still connected with audiences, Gummo seemed to confuse and alienate them, making it harder to define what Harmony Korine's films are or who they were actually for. And he went on towards that direction yet again with a film called Julien Donkey-Boy, pushing the form even more. Shot using Dogma 95 principles, the film strips away lighting, stability, and conventional structure, focusing instead on ideas of intimacy and unpredictability. So at this stage, all his films are starting to be known for not following a structure. They don't guide the viewer and don't aim for resolution. So from the outside looking in, it looks like a shift from an early breakthrough to an unresolved point in this trajectory. And I call it unresolved because the work no longer aligns with what the system and audiences perhaps expected, rather than Korine stopping altogether. However, my opinion is that these films aren't bad at all. I think the issue was more likely because they rejected nearly every expectation of what a successful traditional film and storytelling should look like, which led momentum to stall and the career trajectory that many expected to go up to just basically hit a point where it starts to unravel. Korine was making deliberate choices, and with them he signaled that he was rejecting the formulas that the industry had created. So he had no interest in clean narratives and structured plots. But at the same time, he also wasn't chasing studio expectations, bigger budgets, marketable stars, predictable pacing. They weren't also incentives to Korine. They were almost like restrictions in his eyes. And so he focused mostly on what his principles seem to always have been: life experience and observation. When we look at Gummo, he filmed in a tornado-ravaged town in Ohio, working with non-professional actors to capture real people living in difficult circumstances. He structured scenes around sensations and feelings rather than plot, creating what I call a disjointed, yet I would say immersive experience. In Julien Donkey-Boy, he focused on handheld cameras, natural light, and improvised a lot of dialogue, which resulted in scenes that are sometimes very chaotic or uncomfortable and more or less unpredictable. And in this context, every decision that he made seemingly reflected a conscious philosophy the director had. Cinema should feel real, even if it's difficult to watch. So every jarring image in this context and every awkward rhythm was chosen to provoke the audience, to challenge expectations, and to explore what stands in life on the margins. Along the way, he also made films worth mentioning, such as Mr. Lonely, a story that felt intimate, strange, and actually unmistakably his own, about a young American who works in Paris as a Michael Jackson lookalike and who ends up meeting Marilyn Monroe, who in turn invites him to her commune in Scotland, where she lives with Charlie Chaplin and her daughter Shirley Temple. Then came Trash Humpers, shot on VHS, which gave it a bit of a rough, abrasive look to it. And it basically is an experimental black comedy featuring a loser gang cult freak collective, as I read, engaging in bizarre and destructive behavior on the streets of Nashville, Tennessee. And so, as you can tell, each film continues this pattern of rejecting the norms of Hollywood and essentially claiming control over the kind of work one could make. And this is where the turning point begins. What looks like a decline is actually based on intention, because Korine's career doesn't fall off the rails per se, it just follows an unconventional path that mainly prioritizes vision over validation and self-expression over standards and convention. And I would also add experimentation over safe branding. And this philosophy, to reject the system rather than bend to it, is what makes his work impossible to categorize, but unforgettable to those who experience it. However, years after Gummo and Julien Donkey-Boy, which seemed to be among the most popular films he had done, people assumed that Harmony Korine had vanished from filmmaking. But in 2012, he returned with a film called Spring Breakers. And this film quickly became a cult hit because it essentially played with all Hollywood expectations. The film itself leans into pop culture, party imagery, music, social media aesthetics, and I would say also recognizable archetypes in terms of characters, yet it cleverly subverts every element. Characters indulge in excess, crime, and chaos, and the camera seems to almost also indulge in it as well by adding this layer of very surreal beauty to it all, amidst all the chaos, tension, and discomfort. And this was a film, though, that was different from the others because it was more accessible, or accessible enough to draw viewers in, but wild enough to remind us that this is Harmony Korine's world, not a studio's one. However, this wasn't a return to Hollywood per se, as many thought it was. It was what I call a strange compromise. What I mean by this is that I feel like Korine bent to the system just enough to use its resources, its imagery, its star power with recognizable faces without really compromising the uncompromising sensibility that defined him. And Spring Breakers ended up being simultaneously recognizable but also alien in a way. And that duality is exactly why Korine matters today, because in an era dominated by this over-polished storytelling and an obsession with marketability, it's easier than ever to make films look good, but it's harder to make them truly feel personal or leave a stranger impression or even just be memorable to an audience. Films that carry the voice of one artist rather than the compromises of a system. And so in this instance, I can say that Korine's work reminds me that words like risk, discomfort, and unpredictability, which we use throughout today's video, can be precious tools in a way, and that what feels chaotic on the surface can actually be quite deliberate too, and that the personal vision of a filmmaker can survive and even thrive in a world built to smooth out rough edges. And this is what makes Harmony Korine not just a director who escaped Hollywood or who tanked his career on purpose, as many seem to think, but a director whose films continue to challenge, provoke, and inspire other creatives years after the first frame was even shot. And while Baby Invasion, his latest film released in 2024, was pretty weird, I'm not gonna lie, I still look forward to see what he brings next, because I think that someone that started like him and made the films that he made has always something interesting to put on the table, even if that interest derives only from challenging your expectations. Thanks for watching.